Chapter 142. Shizun, this is cruel and unusual. In the split second before Moran looked over, inspiration had struck Chiwaning. He'd spun around at the last possible moment, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and leaving Moran a plain view of the lean, well-proportioned muscles of his back. This way, Moran wouldn't be able to see his front. Chiwaning thought he was being awfully clever, but the dummy didn't realize he'd only exposed to Moran the sensual dimples low on his back, his full and firm buttocks, and his slender and powerful legs. He was like a rabbit who'd peeled off its own pelt and climbed over the fire to grill itself to a delectable crisp. He was practically saying, "Please enjoy, thanks." Moran felt his throat go dry. His eyes reddened, and he had to steady himself for a moment before he could speak. "Shizun, what are you doing?" What was he doing? His position was clearly a little strange. What could he say to smooth this over without arousing suspicion? Chiwaning glanced over his shoulder, his expression cold and solemn as he racked his brain. Moran had already set his clothes down and was walking toward him. Perhaps it was because his back was to the light. Chiwaning thought the expression on Moran's face was frightening, like a wolf in the wild that had been starved for too long and was looking at a fresh, tender piece of meat. But the meat was hung over the jaws of a trap, and thus the wolf hesitated. His hunger and reason waged a fierce battle, the flames of it spreading to his eyes. Those dark eyes were terribly bright, lit with a haunting radiance. Finally realizing that something was not quite right, Chiwaning knocked 3 sharp words on a bow and pierced through this peculiar atmosphere with one sentence. "Scrub my back." "Huh?" It took Moran a moment to respond, and when he did, it was as if the moisture in his breath had frozen in his throat. He sounded a little husky and rather sensual. "What?" At the end of his wits, Chiwaning had come up with a random excuse in his panic. But since he'd said it, he might as well commit. He faked calm and stonily said, "Since you're here, scrub my back before you go." There was no reply from Moran. "I've been sweating from all the work we've done these last few days. It's uncomfortable." Chiwaning threw everything he had into appearing nonchalant and unconcerned. "It'd be nice to be scrubbed clean." He couldn't tell if Moran was buying it, if his lies were convincing. Either way, Moran obediently did as he was told. He brought over a towel, soaked it in warm water, and began to scrub Chiwaning's back. Yuheng of the night sky had always been wise. This had to be the stupidest thing he'd ever done. What was the most excruciating torture in the world? It was to have the person he loved standing right behind him, those large hands dragging across his body, separated by a single coarse washcloth, each stroke skimming over a thin layer of water to leave a trail of heated, reddened skin in its wake. Even with Moran holding his strength in check, the firmness of his strokes, along with the fact that Chiwaning's body had never before been caressed like this, made every fiber of his muscles tremble. It was all he could do to keep his entire body still, barely managing to conceal his unusual state from the man behind him. He pressed his forehead against the wall and bit down hard on his lip, where Moran couldn't see. The rims of his phoenix eyes red, and his desire so unbearably hot and hard that moisture collected there as dew gathered upon a branch. He had no sexual experience whatsoever. How could he possibly stand before the one he loved and pretend to be virtuous and dignified while enduring this kind of stimulation? It was excruciating. Now, if you asked Moran what the most agonizing torture in the world would be to him, his answer would probably be somewhat different. It was to have a certain man standing naked in front of him, hands braced against the wall, smooth planes of his shoulders and back spread before him, wholly unsuspecting as he offered up his body to Moran, and his filthy thoughts letting him rub his fevered hands all over that body, with only that vexatious washcloth in the way. Moran knew he was just scrubbing his Shizun's back for him, but if he were to apply even a touch more force, this man's skin would bloom red, looking bullied, abused, erotic. Moran's hands pressed over Chwanning's shoulder blades and slid down to the small of his back. As his dawdling hands came to the sides of Chwanning's waist, their strokes unconsciously grew more vigorous. He thought he felt the person beneath him tremble, but he was probably just imagining it. His eyes, fixed on those fair, plump curves, grew bloodshot with the effort it took to stop himself from tossing the washcloth aside and reaching out to grab and squeeze with his bare hands until he'd left marks in the form of 5 provocative red streaks. He had long since tasted the ambrosial nectar of the man before him. How could he be expected to stand before Chwanning and pretend to be honorable and gentlemanly while swallowing down his hunger? It was excruciating. Time stretched endlessly as the two stewed in their respective torments. If this scrubbing were to continue, the both of them just might catch fire. At last, Chwanning couldn't contain himself. Voice cracking, he said, "You can go. I can reach the rest of my back. I'll do it myself." Moran, forehead covered in a sheen of sweat, released the breath he'd been holding. His voice was low. "Yes, Shizun." The curtains rustled. Moran was gone. A long moment passed as Chwanning leaned against the wall, forehead pressed to the cool surface, unable to pull himself together. The tips of his ears were blood red, mirroring the marks left in the wake of the scrubbing. He wondered whether Moran had noticed. He cracked open his phoenix eyes and bit his lower lip in humiliation. After hesitating at length, he reached down to touch himself, where he was so hard it almost hurt. He'd run back to the shower in an attempt to suppress these vulgar impulses. Who could have known the heavens had other plans, and circumstances would see him pushed even deeper beneath the waves of desire by Moran? Chwanning had ever relied on his purity-based cultivation to suppress his primal needs. But now he finally couldn't resist any longer and resorted to this base, humiliating method to relieve himself of the desire that threatened to spill out of him. His lips were lightly parted, his phoenix eyes half-lidded. His expression was somewhat pathetic, somewhat aggrieved. He pressed his burning forehead to the icy wall, delicate shoulders hunched, and the jut of his throat bobbed as he tried to suppress his low, choked gasps. So sinful, yet so beautiful, like a white swallowtail butterfly snared in a spider's web, wings powerlessly quivering in the tightly knit lust, never, never, never to escape. He'd finally been dirtied to the bone, dirtied so wretchedly, so pitifully, that the filth was an allure unto itself, one that tempted others to violation, drew them into addiction. When it was over, Chwanning slammed his fist against the wall. That strike had so much viciousness, so much fury, so much resentment, that it split the skin of his knuckles. Blood seeped out. Bastard! He didn't know if he was cursing himself or Moran. Chwanning's eyes were damp and vaguely dazed, filled both with tender affection and regretful self-loathing. Thus time went on. In the blink of an eye, a month had passed since they'd arrived at Yuliang village. The busy harvest season was coming to an end. Since the day of the back scrub, Chwanning had avoided Moran, as snakes and scorpions avoid ferocious beasts. Not because he noticed anything unusual about Moran's behavior, but because he couldn't accept the change in himself. It was natural that someone who had remained pure and austere for so many years would grow accustomed to it. Why else would Chuaning be so scornful toward those who paired off to dual cultivate? It wasn't that he was jealous. The Yuheng elder truly found such acts unbearably distasteful, even sickening. He also didn't look at erotica, because he really had no desire to. His avoidance wasn't put on for the sake of appearances. To Chuaning, liking someone or kissing them were things he could tolerate. Anything further, masturbation for example, or intercourse, would make his face go blue. He couldn't take it. He was like someone who had been vegetarian his entire life. He might think a bit of lard smelled good if you snuck it into his bowl, but would probably die of disgust if you gave him a piece of seared meat, still pink on the inside. That day, after he'd gotten himself off in a confused flurry, Chuaning had sobered. He'd panted as he stared at the stickiness in his hand, and felt as if a bucket of cold water had been appended on him. His face went pale. What was he doing? Was he so stirred up by a kid barely past 20 that he couldn't restrain himself? That he actually needed to touch himself to pacify the rolling tides in his heart? Gooseflesh had sprung up on Chuaning's back. From that moment on, he'd kept 3 feet away from Moran at all times, afraid he might accidentally unleash the raging beast in his heart and do something regrettable. As he withdrew, so did Moran. When Moran reflected on what had happened, he too was terrified. He'd discovered that his yearning for Chuaning was much stronger than anticipated. The dam he'd erected could barely hold back the tempestuous currents, and the passion in his bones was going to overflow at any minute. He was keenly aware that one moment of weakness was all it took to go from man to beast. He didn't want to hurt Chuaning again, so he unconsciously avoided him. With the distance interposed between them, they almost seemed merely a respectful disciple and a benevolent master. In this way, the days passed peacefully, without incident. One day, the village hunter caught a plump deer. The villagers proposed holding a bonfire in the evening at the small drying field near the entrance of the settlement. Every household contributed food, from pasties to dried meats, and the village chief opened 2 jars of Gaoliang liquor. The crowd sat together, jolly with anticipation. How merry it was to watch the dancing of the bonfire, to smell the aromatic grease of roasted venison, and eat and drink together. Chuaning and Moran sat apart. The 2 settled down with the bonfire between them, gazing at each other through the flames, each hoping the other wouldn't notice. One would sneak a discreet glance, only to meet the eyes of the other and pretend it was a coincidence, dropping his gaze. After a few seconds, when the other was unguarded, that gaze would secretly fix upon the other's face once more. Orange light surged and firewood crackled. Laughter and cheer flowed and eddied around them, but they had neither eyes nor ears for any other. The moon in the sky seemed to shine for these 2 beating hearts alone. The jars of liquor the village chief had opened quickly emptied, but the party went on unbaited. Moran, remembering that he still had a jar of the top-quality pear blossom white in his own residence, excused himself and rose to go grab it. He was halfway to his room when he heard a noise behind him. He turned. "Who's there?" The rustling of footsteps instantly paused. A pair of verdant green shoes, embroidered with yellow flowers, slowly shuffled from around the corner. Moran blinked. "Oh, it's you, Miss Linger." Linger had drunk a little too much, and her snowy jade-like cheeks were flushed red, her lips rich and bright. She stood under the moonlight, gazing at him with affection, her full bosom rising and falling with her quickened breath. "Was Yanjin?" she said. "Please wait. I have something I wanted to say to you.